My name carried across the auditorium, sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the bright stage lights. I stepped forward to collect my diploma, still hoping, against all logic, that I would spot them in the crowd. 8 seats in the family section had been reserved under our last name. All 8 remained untouched. No wave, no smile, not even a silhouette. Only a row of empty chairs staring back at me while every other graduate was met with cheers loud enough to rattle the ceiling. I let out a small, breathless laugh and kept walking. 8 months slipped by. Then my $5.5 million penthouse hit the real estate news, and that was the moment my phone lit up with the first message I'd received from them since graduation. Family dinner. 6 p.m. Important discussion. I went, just not in the way they expected. My name is Vera Collins, and for as long as I can remember, I learned how to shrink inside my own home. No one ever told me I had to. The rules were simply there, silent, rigid, and older than any of us, shaping how we moved around one another. Elise, my older sister, was the golden one, the girl who never heard the word no. Ryan, the youngest, was the one everyone wrapped in excuses and forgiveness, even for messes he knowingly created. And me? I became the quiet solution, the steady pair of hands, the filler for every gap they left behind. The pattern began long before I understood it. I still remember the morning Elise forgot her science project. She panicked at the door, crying as if her future depended on that cardboard volcano. My mother reacted the same way. Without thinking, I offered her mine, the one I had spent a week building. Elise won second place. No one ever asked why I didn't turn anything in. Mom only said, "Vera always figures things out," as though it were admiration instead of a dismissal. Years later, when I finally earned enough from my first part-time job, I bought myself a small set of drafting tools, my first real step toward a dream I never dared say out loud. Before I even opened the package, Dad pulled me aside to ask if he could borrow the money for a bill Elise had forgotten to pay. "You're responsible," he said, already pocketing the cash. "She means well, she just needs time." Arguing felt pointless, so I just nodded, like always. Even my birthdays carried the same predictable script. One year, I baked a cake for the family, chocolate, Mom's favorite, and watched everyone else make a wish before I even had the chance to blow out a single candle. Elise strolled in late that day, balancing a plastic box of store-bought cookies as if she were carrying a treasure. Mom kissed her cheek the moment she walked through the door and said, "You always think of the sweetest things." I stood there with the cake server still warm in my hand, realizing in one quiet moment that my effort had dissolved into the background, erased so effortlessly that no one even noticed. But the memory that stitched all the others together, the one that still presses cold against my ribs, came years later in the cramped studio apartment I could barely afford. It was winter, and the heating had given up weeks earlier. I sat wrapped in 2 jackets, hunched over a chipped desk, working on revisions for a duplex floor plan I dreamed of renovating someday. Papers lay scattered across the table, payment reminders, overdue balances, rent warnings flashing on my phone like accusations. I called Dad, not for money, not for rescue, just for guidance, just to hear something steady for a moment. He answered, but his voice was sharp, impatient. "Real estate is for men who understand numbers, Vera. You should aim for something safer." Before I could respond, he hung up. That night, the stitching on my black portfolio split open. Instead of throwing it away, I sat under the weak glow of my desk lamp and sewed it shut by hand. Every time the needle pierced through the fabric, my fingers trembled, but I kept going. That portfolio turned into the one thing that stayed with me through every project afterward, patched, imperfect, but mine. Then came graduation. My name rose above the roar of the stadium, lifted by applause that felt too big for the space I occupied. I looked toward the family section, toward the row marked with 8 cards carrying my last name. Every chair was empty. They hadn't forgotten. They had chosen not to come. And that was the day the truth settled in. I was not a priority, not even for a moment. 8 months slipped quietly after that ceremony. Clean, empty months, where no one said my name unless it was to measure it against someone else's success. I worked. I saved. I signed every deal I could reach. And I kept every piece of news to myself. Silence felt safer than handing them something they could ignore all over again. One afternoon, I was sitting in my old Honda outside a job site, letting the engine vibrate softly under my palm while I reviewed a revised valuation. A notification flashed across my phone, an article forwarded by a colleague whose name I barely remembered. Without thinking, I tapped it open. Local developers turned my modest 5-unit renovation into a penthouse triumph, and suddenly it was making real estate headlines everywhere. My name sat boldly beneath the title, printed in clean black letters above a photo of the building I had rebuilt, inch by inch, late night by late night. The article listed everything: the numbers, the timeline, the renovation strategy, the projected returns. My phone vibrated non-stop with forwarded links and congratulations from acquaintances I barely remembered. But not a single message came from my family. I placed the phone face down on the passenger seat and stared out the windshield. Heavy afternoon clouds rolled over the sky, dimming everything in slow motion. For a strange moment, I didn't feel excitement or pride. I felt still, as if the world had paused, waiting for me to decide what came next. Then the phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen and froze. It wasn't a colleague this time. It was my father. The message was short, clipped, unmistakably him. No greeting, no warmth, no acknowledgement of anything I had achieved. Family dinner at 6 p.m., important discussion. A second message followed almost immediately. Don't be late. I held the phone between my fingers, the cold screen pressing against my skin, and felt the weight of 8 silent months settle like dust over me. This wasn't an olive branch. It wasn't a celebration. It wasn't even curiosity. It was a summons, a transaction disguised as family concern. For a moment, I didn't breathe. Then, in the old rhythm my body still remembered from childhood, I inhaled slowly, let my shoulders fall back into place, and typed the only response he deserved. I'll be there. I set the phone down and turned the engine back on. The streetlights flickered awake one by one as the sky darkened, stretching into evening. Whatever they wanted from me, one truth had already been carved out clearly. They only remembered me when the world did. The message remained on my lock screen long after the car had stopped rumbling beneath me. I stayed there in the fading light, my hands still resting on the wheel, listening to the faint vibration of yet another notification, another article, another congratulations. Echo through the cold plastic. The world suddenly had an opinion about me. Everyone did. After months of absolute silence, even my family found their voice again. But I didn't drive home right away. I wasn't ready to walk into their expectations or whatever trap they had set under the word discussion. Instead, I turned into the small parking lot behind my office building. The one none of them had ever seen, the one they never cared to ask about. The sky was sinking into that bluish-gray shade that always made Seattle appear calmer than it ever truly was. I locked my car, climbed the narrow stairs, and let the heavy metal door shut behind me with a final, echoing thud. Inside, the familiar buzz of fluorescent lights wrapped around me in a way that felt almost protective. I placed my black portfolio on the desk, the same portfolio I had sewn together by hand years ago on a freezing winter night. The crooked seam was still visible in the corner, a soft reminder of who I used to be, a girl stitching a dream together in the dim glow of a desk lamp, hoping one day she would have something worth placing inside it. I opened it carefully. Paper slid against paper, contracts, valuations, spreadsheets, progress reports. My entire career lined up in neat signatures and dated milestones. Not a single page owed anything to my family. I didn't feel anger, and I didn't feel victory. What I felt was clarity, sharp and measured. I turned on my laptop, letting the low hum of the fan fill the room. My hands moved without hesitation, checking project ledgers, reviewing payments, highlighting the line items scheduled to close within the next 6 weeks. Numbers steadied me in a way people never had. Email, spreadsheet, signed, filed, archived, deleted. Each click landed with the quiet rhythm of a heartbeat. At 6:42 p.m., I finally stood and crossed the office to the long window overlooking the city. The building across the street had already switched on its lights, each room glowing in warm amber squares that stacked like a honeycomb. My reflection hovered in the glass, blazer wrinkled from the long day, hair tied back too tightly, fatigue carving angles along my jawline, but the face staring back at me was unmistakably my own. A face that had earned every inch of the $5 million penthouse mentioned in that headline. I watched my own reflection draw a breath. It struck me how long it had been since I'd actually stopped to notice myself doing something as simple as that. My phone vibrated on the desk behind me. Another message. This one not from my father. Someone from a downtown firm offering congratulations on the penthouse. I let it buzz. 10 seconds later, another message. A reporter asking for a quote. Then another. Soon the phone was skittering across the wooden surface like a restless animal desperate for attention. I flipped it over and switched the sound off. Silence settled back into the room. This quiet, was what mattered, not their sudden noise. My plans were already moving forward, piece by piece. I sat back down and pulled out the acquisition file I'd finalized that morning, the one for the commercial plaza that had eaten 4 months of my life. Negotiations that dragged, site visits in the rain, midnight calls with inspectors who never answered on time. It was the most critical purchase I had ever made. And it didn't escape me that the plaza was a centerpiece in nearly every major development proposal in the district. I didn't know officially that my father and Gerald were aiming for it, but in real estate, especially in a city as compact and interconnected as Seattle, you learn more from quiet conversations than public ones. You hear things when you work silently, when you don't brag, when you pay attention rather than trying to be seen. I traced my fingers along the edge of the final page, the one with my signature pressed firmly in black ink, only hours earlier. They wanted me at dinner. They wanted something from me, something significant. I didn't need a confrontation to understand that. What I needed was certainty. So I reread every clause, every footnote, every closing condition until I could recite them from memory. Then I slid the entire packet into my black portfolio and smoothed it down with my palm. The motion felt final, like shutting a door behind me. By the time the office clock blinked to 7:19 p.m., the windows had darkened into a deep navy blue. I reached for my coat, then paused. The fabric felt unnecessary, too soft, too personal for the kind of evening waiting for me. I left it hanging where it was and walked out with only the portfolio in my hand. The hallway lights clicked off behind me in sequence as I moved, leaving the building in its usual after-hours hush. Outside, my old Honda sat patiently in the lot, its faded paint catching what little streetlight filtered through the branches. I unlocked the car, set the portfolio gently on the passenger seat, and slid behind the wheel. For a moment, I just sat there, watching the city exhale. Traffic thinning, streetlights flickering awake, wind teasing the last fragile leaves of early autumn. Everything I had built had grown out of this kind of quiet. As I merged onto the freeway, the city unfolded in front of me like a map I knew by heart. I passed the buildings I'd renovated. I drove by the bus stops where I used to stand for hours because my family never offered to pick me up. I crossed the same bridge I had walked home over more times than I liked to admit. Each spot was its own tally mark. Here is where they weren't. Here is where I learned to keep going without them. The portfolio rested unmoving beside me. I reached out, brushing my fingers along the uneven stitched seam. I didn't rehearse what I would say at dinner. There was no point. Words had never meant much in that house. They talked over apologies. Ignored explanations, and stepped through every boundary I tried to set, as if it were nothing more than a draft line on a blueprint. Eventually, I learned not to waste my breath. So tonight, I wouldn't bring anger. I wouldn't bring excuses or explanations. I would bring something stronger, proof. When I approached the turn into my parents' neighborhood, I eased my foot on the brake. The houses lined the street like trimmed, quiet witnesses. Identical lawns. Identical hedges. Porch lights blinked on one by one as the sun slipped behind the hill. I pulled into their driveway at 6:59 p.m. My father would appreciate the precision, even if he never said it. The house glowed with that familiar, heavy gold light. Through the dining room window, I saw silhouettes shifting. Elise leaning forward, Ryan gesturing wildly, Dad pacing like he always did when he wanted to control the room. None of them had any idea what rested in the passenger seat of my car. I opened the door, stepped out, and adjusted the collar of my blazer. One slow breath in, one steady breath out. Then I walked toward the house. They wanted an important discussion. Fine. I had something important, too. The front door swung open before I could knock. My father stood there, shoulders squared, posture stiff, greeting me the same way he greeted clients he barely tolerated. Not a hint of softness for the daughter he hadn't spoken to in 8 months. "You're right on time," he said, stepping aside. No hug. No welcome. Just approval for punctuality, as if that were the only part of me worth acknowledging. The dining room was already filled. Elise sat with perfect posture, lazily swirling her wine like she was bored already. Ryan leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table in an impatient rhythm. Gerald straightened his tie, preparing himself the way he always did before pitching a deal. My mother hovered behind her seat, smiling too brightly, too quickly. I took the chair farthest from the head of the table, the one deliberately left empty, the role they'd assigned me long before I ever arrived. Dad cleared his throat. "Let's get straight to it. We have an opportunity on the table." Gerald leaned forward, fingers interlocking with the precision of someone about to present a slideshow. "A warehouse district redevelopment," he said. "Prime land, strong projections. We're ready to move, but we need capital to finish." No hesitation. No shame. They didn't flinch at the bluntness. Dad nodded. "We thought this could be a family partnership. You come in with funding, and we guide the project. Everyone wins." Elise lifted her wine glass. "It's generous, honestly, given how new you are to all this." Ryan let out a laugh under his breath. "Yeah. You'd get to learn from people with actual experience." My mother reached across the table and placed a hand on my arm, her smile soft and rehearsed. "Sweetheart, this is your chance to be part of something bigger than yourself." Their words layered over each other, thin, sharp, dismissive, perfectly synchronized. Not a single apology. Not a single acknowledgement of the months of silence. Just their plan drifting into the air like steam from the roast cooling on the table. I reached for my black portfolio and placed it softly on the table. The sound, quiet, deliberate, cut through the chatter like a dropped coin in a silent church. The room froze. "I did come for an important discussion," I said, my voice even. "Just not yours." My father's eyes narrowed. "Vera, we don't have time for..." I unfastened the portfolio and opened it. A neatly clipped stack of papers slid into the glow of the candle, their edges catching the light. Gerald leaned in, his forehead creasing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "Is that the commercial plaza?" I asked quietly. "The one every major development firm has been trying to scoop up for months?" My father drew in a sharp breath. "You're exaggerating. That property isn't even on the market." I held his gaze. "It was about 4 months ago." I set the signed acquisition papers on the table. The polished surface reflected their faces. Elise gone pale. Ryan frozen mid-movement. My father's jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. Gerald's hands shook slightly as he reached for the documents. "You bought it," he murmured. "All of it?" I gave a single nod. "Which means your warehouse district project no longer has an anchor property. And without an anchor, there's no financing, no approval, and definitely no investors." It took a moment before Dad finally spoke. "Why would you do this? You knew we were pursuing it." "No," I corrected gently. "I knew the city was. And unlike you, I don't sit around waiting for opportunities to land in my lap." My mother's voice wavered. "Vera, we're supposed to be a family." "A family shows up," I said. "You missed my graduation. You missed everything. But you never missed a headline that made you look good." A heavy silence settled over the table, thick, unmoving, impossible to break. I gathered the papers again, slid them into the portfolio, and closed it with a quiet snap. "You asked for an important conversation," I reminded them. "Well, here it is." Dad's shoulders slumped. Elise stared down at her untouched meal. Ryan muttered something under his breath, barely more than a whisper. I stood, adjusting the collar of my blazer the way I always did when I was finished defending myself. "Dinner's all yours," I said. "But the future? That belongs to me." No one got up. No one tried to stop me. They only sat there, silent for the first time in a long while. Outside, the night air was colder than I expected, slicing through the thin fabric of my blazer. The porch light hummed behind me, flickering just the way it used to when I was a kid. I paused there for a moment, letting the last trace of warmth from the house fade from my skin. I walked toward my Honda, pulled the door open, and slid into the driver's seat. The interior carried the faint scent of worn fabric mixed with the last traces of a vanilla air freshener I kept telling myself I'd replace. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and let my breathing slow. Through the windshield, the front windows of my parents' dining room were still visible. I could make out shifting silhouettes, someone pointing, someone collapsing back into a chair, but not a single word reached me. For once, the silence felt like something I had earned. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A message from my mother lit up the screen. "We never knew how to fix things. Please don't give up on us." I didn't open it. I didn't delete it. I simply turned the phone face down and switched on the engine. The drive home followed the same streets I had traveled since I was a teenager. I passed the corner store where Elise once kept me waiting in the cold so she could chat with her friends. I passed the park where Ryan used to brag that Dad always made sure he succeeded. I passed the hill that felt impossibly steep when I climbed it alone at 16. Now those places seemed smaller, as if they belonged to someone else's childhood. When I reached downtown, the city lights rose around me, steady and pale like molten gold. My building stood at the end of the block, its glass exterior glowing under the streetlights like a beacon. I parked, took the elevator up, and unlocked my door. The quiet inside was nothing like the strained silence I had just left behind. There was no tension wedged between walls, no unfinished apologies waiting to be spoken. Just space, clean, open, and entirely mine. I set the portfolio on the kitchen island. The stitched border caught the overhead lights, throwing a thin shadow across the marble. I ran a finger along the seam, remembering the freezing night I had sewn it together in a tiny studio with no heat. Back then, silence felt like a punishment. Tonight, it felt like recognition. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and rested my forehead against the cool glass. The city stretched beneath me, steady, vast, honest. For the first time in years, I felt no need to justify my choices to anyone. It finally made sense. Silence isn't painful on its own. It only hurts when the wrong people break it. I gazed out over the city one last time. The glass reflected nothing but my own silhouette, steady, unbroken, finally my own. All my life, I had saved seats for people who never appeared, held space for apologies that never came. Tonight, I realized something simpler. Boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are the quiet doors we close so our own lives have room to breathe. I switched off the lights, letting the apartment sink into a calm, well-earned darkness. If you've ever rebuilt yourself in the space someone else abandoned, I want to know, where are you listening from? Some stories don't truly begin until we stop waiting.